Hi, everybody. I hope you've been having a nice, awesome, long President's Day weekend and that you're spending all of your days off thinking about all of those U.S. presidents, past presidents, current president, who have taken on one of the toughest jobs that you can possibly imagine. I certainly wouldn't want to do it. As you've no doubt noticed lately, modern presidential politics can get pretty ugly with intense debates, fighting, and a lot of mudslinging. These debates are as crucially significant for American life as they are sometimes ludicrous. Well, I'd like you to also realize that in some ways this has always been the case, going back to the founding of the country. Americans sometimes seem to share only one thing in common, that they disagree furiously over really fundamental principles about the United States and about the future of the United States, and even what the United States of America means. And as we'll see, this rancor was even part of the constitutional debate itself. But that's why I'm calling this whole review video today Conflicting Visions, and focusing on the ways in which American history, to a really large degree, has always been a debate over the meaning of America itself. But before we get to that, here's what's up. Uh, Here's a review of where we're at as we move into week 6, what you can expect to come up, and a lot of things that you want to pay attention to and due dates for the next couple of weeks. The first thing is you'll have noticed probably by now that some grades have been posted. The grades for quiz number 3 are up, and the grades for all of the participation activities up to this point have been posted. So you can check your total participation points grade, and you can check your grades for quiz number 3. Quiz number 4 and the second homework assignment will be graded all throughout this week until next weekend. Next, there will be a video review quiz, a quiz based on this video you're watching right now, which will be due at the normally scheduled quiz time, 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, February 23rd. This video quiz is worth 70 points like every other quiz, except all those points will be taken into your participation points grade. So you really want to pay attention to that. This is a big one. Watch this video, answer the quiz questions about the video, get the points for participation. The regularly scheduled online quiz number 5, will be due now on Sunday, so by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, February 26. The study guide has been posted up in the week 6 module. You'll see all the questions there based on chapters 9 and 10 of the textbook. Much of that we'll be getting into on Friday, so you want to begin doing all that reading and get ready to take the quiz on Sunday, February 26. Also in that study guide for quiz number 5, you'll see the prompt for homework number 3, which is due by Sunday, March 5th. So this will be the third and final homework assignment. You can check that prompt out. We'll be going over it in class on Friday. Now, as for participation points, I know you want to rack those up. You need to get 150 of them at least by the end of the semester. If you get more than 150, it's going to count as extra credit, up to at least 200 points. So you want to be getting in as much participation points as possible. You can do that by taking the video review quiz that you see right here by this Thursday. You'll also see under quizzes a flash constitution quiz, which is due by Friday, February 24th. This is a multiple choice quiz. It's timed. You have 2 attempts to take it. These are multiple choice questions about the Constitution. So you take the quiz, and then you take it again if you need to, and the highest grade counts for participation points. Also, you'll see that I've done some re-rigging of the syllabus, so you're going to see there's an extra quiz at the end of the semester in week 8, quiz number 7, which is also now available. What I'm going to do is, if you go look at your quiz grades right now, you'll see that the lowest grade is marked as dropped because, according to the schedule, I dropped the lowest quiz grade. Instead of doing that, I'm going to count all the 5 highest quiz grades that you have for your quizzes grade, and then any quiz points after that will go towards participation. So there'll be a total of 7 quizzes for the semester. The 5 highest ones go into your quiz score. Any points you get after that for any of the quizzes will be dumped into the participation grade bucket. So here's a lot of different ways to get points. And if you have any questions about this, email me. I will review this again when I see you all on Friday. Now, as you watch this video, pay attention to questions in yellow all throughout. These are the quiz questions for the review quiz due on Thursday. So it's kind of like the study guide that you're already used to, except the study guide is in the video itself. There'll be 7 questions that will appear in yellow. Pay attention to the answers, absorb the information, and then use those answers to answer the quiz questions due by Thursday. So okay, there you go. Let's get to it. Conflicting visions. This is going to be a review video, so we're stepping back a little bit. If you remember, the last time I saw you, we were talking about the American Revolution, and then you watched a video on the period between the Revolution and the creation of the Constitution and wrote a paper about the relationship between revolutionary principles and the articulation of the U.S. Constitution. So by now you should be familiar with a lot of the stuff that we're going to go through, but I'm going to highlight some things because repetition for this important document is not a bad thing at all. So in 1787, 55 delegates representing every state except for Rhode Island attended one or more of the sessions of the Constitutional Convention that sat in the Philadelphia State House from May to September 1787. We've come to call these men the founders or the founding fathers because of what they did in that room. So what did they do in that room? And here's a question I've been asking, I wanted you to think about, and I hope you're still thinking about it or have some really firm idea now about the answer to it, which is, what is the Constitution? Now you see this question is not in yellow, so this one is not on the quiz. This is a big question that I hope you have an answer to right now. And it's complicated. The meaning of the Constitution is something that historians have debated. It's inspired debate from the moment it was drafted. Some argue that the Constitution is a flexible document intended to evolve in response to society's evolution. Others have said that it has a fixed meaning, that it's rooted in, quote, original intent of the framers of the Constitution, and they moved beyond that to deny, and to move beyond that is to deny its value. Historians too disagree about why the Constitution was written and what it meant. To some scholars, the creation of the federal system was an effort to preserve the ideals of the Revolution, as you've been thinking about with your paper, and to create a strong national government capable of exercising real authority. But to others, the Constitution was an effort to protect the economic interests of existing elites, even at the cost of betraying the principles of the Revolution. And to still others, the Constitution was designed to protect individual freedom and to limit the power of the federal government. I would say, just as a sort of mechanical way to think about this document, we should start by saying that the Constitution is the supreme law of the United States. It's a legal document, unlike the Declaration of Independence. In its main body of the document, it's not about individual rights. It's about building the architecture of a new federal or national government. The Constitution takes the ideals and principles of republicanism and builds them into a governmental structure. So read the Constitution as you've had, and you'll see that it is broken into articles and sections, which are about the distribution and allocation of power. And this is fundamental to understand the debates that happen in the Constitutional Convention. Those 55 men who attended that convention were not there representing individual Americans primarily. They were representing state governments. They were there to ensure that the interests of their states, which had become very important in the period after the Declaration of Independence, were looked after in whatever new, stronger national government was going to be created. So the question is, if power is central and the law is central, what is the Constitution's relationship to principles like unity, the unity of the nation, or rights? People talk about constitutional rights all the time. How is that embodied in the Constitution? And of course, how does the Constitution represent one of those key revolutionary principles of democracy? If you think back to the video that you watched last time, Democracy or Chaos, you'll remember that in the 1780s, some of the wealthiest and most powerful groups in the population began to clamor for a stronger national government, feeling that the nation under the Articles of Confederation had become weak and ineffectual. And in particular, because the federal government had lacked the power to tax, this was the weakest point of the federal state. The states themselves jealously held on to the power to tax, and this caused all kinds of problems for people who were concerned about the United States on the national level. So there was a national reform movement. It wasn't by any means all Americans that were calling for a new constitution, but the ones who did were some of the wealthiest and most influential ones. They were also ones who, as you remember, over the course of the 1780s, came to see that unchecked democracy itself would be a possible problem. And so they were looking for to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and revise them into something stronger. Two of the most prominent of those concerned about this state, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, called for a convention in Annapolis in 1786 to revise the Articles of Confederation, but only 5 states sent delegates to this convention. As a result, Madison and others then called for a new convention, one to be held in Philadelphia, that would substantially revise and present a new constitution for the United States. And at first there seemed like there was little reason to believe that this convention was going to attract any more delegates than the Annapolis meeting. But then in early 1787, the news of Shays' rebellion spread throughout the nation, alarming many previously apathetic leaders, including George Washington, who promptly made plans to travel to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. And Washington's support gave the meeting wide credibility. So 55 men representing all the states except Rhode Island attended the Philadelphia Convention from May to September. These founding fathers, as they came to be known, were well educated by the standards of their time. Many were property owners, and many feared what they called the turbulence and follies of democracy. Yet they all retained the revolutionary suspicion of concentrated power. So what they're going to do is the Constitutional Convention is going to be a battle over the distribution of power. They had come to believe, though, that stronger centralized government was essential, that the United States was too weak under the Articles of Confederation to endure, and that in order for a strong state to exist, the power to tax was central also, and there would be need to be some reformation of the inability of the national government to tax. So here's the question that I have for you first about the Philadelphia Convention. Why were the delegates so divided over the design of the Constitution, and how did they resolve those divisions? They had some agreement over the need for a stronger government and the need to tax, but there the agreement kind of ended, and the convention broke into rancor over issues that almost derailed the creation of the new Constitution. So what were these issues? What was their divisions about, and how did they resolve those divisions? So Virginia, the most populous state in the United States, sent a well-prepared delegation to Philadelphia led by James Madison, who had devised in some detail a plan for a new national government. This Virginia plan then shaped the agenda of the convention from the moment it opened by proposing that a national government ought to be established consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary. And even this little brief description right here is fundamentally different than the Articles of Confederation, which contain no executive branch and no courts. The Virginia plan then outlined a proposal for the legislature to be divided in two, so a Congress that would be divided into 2 houses, or a bicameral legislature. In the lower house, the states would be represented in proportion to their population. So a state with a large population would have more representatives in the lower house, and a state with a lower population would have fewer representatives in the house. This had this sort of air of democracy about it. On the other hand, the upper house would be elected by the lower house itself. So representation based on population in the lower house then electing the upper house. Representation basically in the United States, the legislature would be based on population. So there was an argument for democracy. The proposal aroused immediate opposition among delegates from smaller states like New Jersey. And so New Jersey opened up a plan that would retain the essence of the Confederacy with its one house legislature in which all states had equal representation. So one state, one vote. It would, however, give Congress expanded powers to tax and to regulate commerce. The convention rejected this plan, but supporters of the Virginia plan now realize that they would have to make concessions to smaller states. So this was the problem, that the issue was over representation, and this is what the convention became deadlocked on. How are states supposed to retain their power? And this is about the distribution of power. Small states, states with small populations, were deeply afraid that if Virginia's plan went through, they would never have enough votes in Congress to get their interests made into law, and that states with higher populations would eventually dominate the legislature. So let's understand what was at stake in this debate. The issue came around a concept that you should all be very familiar with, which is representation, one of the revolutionary principles that inspired the American Revolution. But it was representation dealt with in a specific way. Now, all the delegates to the convention agreed that a Republican form of government needed to be created, grounded in representing the people of the states. The question was, how could a national government exercise sovereignty at the same time with state governments? Where did ultimate sovereignty lie? So the states themselves had become used to exercising tremendous power after the Declaration of Independence and wanted to hold on to it. How much power would they cede up, and how could a federal government exist with state governments? The solution that Madison came up with, and his contemporaries decided, was federalism. They decided that all power at all levels of government ultimately flowed from the people. Thus, neither the federal government nor the state's government were truly sovereign. So sovereignty was held by the people. All of them derived their authority from below. So the resolution of the problem of sovereignty made possible one of the distinctive features of the Constitution, that is federalism, or the division of powers between the national and state governments. The Constitution and the government it created were to be the supreme law of the land, but at the same time, the Constitution left important powers in the hands of the states. So what was the issue of representation about? It was about representation of states within the new federal government. That is, how were votes to be counted among the states when bills were passed, when Congress has a bill and the states would vote on it? How were the votes to be allocated? And how should representatives be elected? States with large populations said that their state should have more representatives in Congress. That means more votes towards bills. Whereas smaller states said that they should have equal representation in Congress so that the state could have equal weight with other states. So this was a battle of representation of states in the new federal government. The solution that they came up with was the first compromise, or the Great Compromise, of the Constitutional Convention, dealing with representation and states' rights. Now, first of all, on the question of federal power and states' rights, the states had to give up some of their power. Here's just two examples. States were no longer allowed to issue currency. States were no longer allowed to provide debt relief, which was a big problem for people like James Madison in the period after the Declaration of Independence, before the Constitution, as you saw in the video Democracy or Chaos. So appealing to the concept of federalism, the federal and the state governments divided power. So certain powers were given to the federal government in the Constitution, others were reserved for the states. As for this particular issue of representation in Congress that brought those small and large states into deadlock, the compromise made was that there would be two houses, not one. So Congress would have a House of Representatives and a Senate. In the Senate, every state would be given two senators, so 2 votes per state. That means that small states and large states all have the same amount of representation. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, would be based on population to retain this kind of democratic principle of power in the hands of the people. So this was the resolution of this first major conflict over state power. Now, one major question that threatened to derail the entire Constitution was the issue of slavery. So this leads to the second question. Why was the question of slavery so contentious, and how was it resolved? So Understand, first of all, that there was no serious discussion of abolishing slavery during the convention. This wasn't the issue. The delegates weren't there to debate the morality of slavery. Northerners and Southerners weren't there to argue about whether slavery should be ended or not, or what the law should be about slavery. That wasn't the real rubbing point of slavery, and it's really important to understand this. The issue of slavery was all wrapped up in the issue of representation of states in the new federal government. Would slaves be counted as part of the population in determining representation in Congress? Or would they be considered property not entitled to representation? So think about this. You have some of the southern states had huge slave populations. In a place like South Carolina, the slave population was the majority. That means that the white population of South Carolina was small. Although geographically, South Carolina might be a big state, in terms of population, it was a small state. So the fear of South Carolina and other states like Virginia, the majority of the white population in the new United States were further north, was that there would be more representation of northern states in Congress than there would be of southern states because of the dynamic of slavery. So delegates from states with large slave populations wanted to have it both ways. They argued that slaves should be considered persons just in terms of determining representation, being counted by census in order to find out how many delegates they would have in Congress. But as property if the new government was to levy taxes on the states on the basis of population. So if the new federal government was to say tax an individual state based on its population, the southern states didn't want their slaves to be counted as part of their population for purposes of taxes. But for purposes of representation, they wanted slaves to be counted as population so they could have more delegates in the Congress. Now this produced heated debate between northern and southern states over this question. Representatives from states where slavery had disappeared or was expected soon to disappear argued that slaves should be included in calculating taxation but not representation. So they should be counted as property but not for purposes of representation in Congress. So there was bickering back and forth. Ultimately, this led to the second compromise over the issue of slavery. And again, you'll see how this is tied directly to the question of representation and power allocation in the new federal government. So, slavery in the Constitution. You should note, first of all, that you can read the entire text of the Constitution and not find the word slavery or slave anywhere in there. However, the issue of slavery appears in 3 different places as a consequence of this debate and in order to find some compromise to keep the Constitution going. For one thing, it was understood that the new federal government would have broad powers to deal with international trade, and the southern states wanted to be sure that the international slave trade would not be affected by the new Congress, the new federal government, anytime soon. So it's put into the Constitution that the international slave trade, using euphemisms for the language of the slave trade, would be permitted until 1808, at which point the federal government would have the power to make a decision. This is the big one, though, about representation, the 3/5 compromise. That is, the 3/5 compromise counted each slave listed as other persons in the Constitution as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and of taxation. So what that means is when they're counting all the people in each individual state to decide how much taxes should be apportioned to that state and to decide how many representatives they would have in the House of Representatives, every slave would count as 3/5 of a person. Now understand, this had nothing to do with rights. This did not mean that slaves had 3/5 of rights or that 3/5 they counted as 3/5 of a human being. This was just purely a mechanism used to deal with representation and taxation in the federal government. And it's important to understand that this is the big debate about slavery. So this gave southern states more seats in Congress and more power in presidential elections than if only free men were counted. So you see what that means? So southern states with large black populations, large slave populations, had more seats in Congress now because of the 3/5 clause than they would have if they only counted free voting citizens in those individual states. Finally, this was another compromise made for southern states. The Constitution required that all states, whether in the North or the South, are required by law to return fugitive slaves to their original owners. So this was these are seeds of problems to come. You can see that this is a compromise that deals with the issue at hand when it comes to dealing with the Constitution, but it's planting the seeds of future acrimony between northern states, free states, and slave states to come. Now, before getting back to the development of the Constitution, I want to stop here for a minute and just consider the issue of slavery and American ideals. It should probably appear to you to be a serious paradox in American history. It's one of the key problems is a nation that's founded on the principles of the equality of all men and presumably women, although that comes later, and the simultaneous institutionalization of slavery. How is that possible to reconcile these things? A country based on freedom and slavery. Well, one of the key figures to help you work through this puzzle is Thomas Jefferson himself. After all, he was the author of the words "all men are created equal" and the owner of more than 200 slaves. So, and he did write about this, in fact. So as for the third question here for the quiz, I'd like you to take a look in the course archive at Thomas Jefferson writing about slavery and race in 1782. So this is before the Constitution, after the Revolution, when he's already written the Declaration of Independence. Read what he has to say about slavery and race in particular, and answer this question. What were Jefferson's ideas about race, and how did they relate to his ideas about slavery? So you're doing a primary source analysis in here. I really want you to read this closely so we can talk about this on Friday. Read through it and see if you can decode what he has to say about race and what he has to say about slavery. So having compromised and resolved this question of sovereignty and representation of states in the federal government, the Constitution also produced a distinctive problem to the solution to the problem of concentrated authority and the idea of checks and balances. So the next question here, question number 4, is how did the Constitution put checks on both the government power and the popular will? So drawing from ideas of the French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, most Americans had long believed that the best way to avoid tyranny was to keep government close to the people. A large nation would breed corruption and despotism because distant rulers could not be controlled by the people. This was a lesson they had learned as colonies for Great Britain. Madison, however, helped to break the grip of these assumptions by arguing that a large republic would be less likely to produce tyranny because no single group would ever be able to dominate it. So in addition to the concept of federalism and apportioning power between the states and the federal government, the idea of many centers of power checking one another and preventing any single despotic authority from emerging also helped shape the internal structure of the federal government. The Constitution's most distinctive feature in this case was separations of power within the government, managed by a system of what they called checks and balances among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The forces within the government would theoretically constantly compete with one another. Congress would have 2 chambers, the House and the Senate, each checking each other, since both would have to agree before any law could be passed. The President would have the power to veto acts of Congress if it was believed that those acts were going outside of the law. The federal courts would be protected from both the executive and the legislature because judges would be serving for life. So you have the executive branch, the legislative, and the judicial. The judicial branch, the Supreme Court, would appoint Supreme Court justices for life, meaning that they couldn't be fired by one other branch of government. So they were insulated and their power was protected. So this federal structure of the government was designed to protect the United States from the kind of despotism that Americans believe had emerged in England. But it was also, so it was designed to limit government, but it was also designed to limit democracy. It was designed to protect the nation from another kind of despotism, that is the tyranny of the people, as it came to be called, as James Madison came to think of it. Shays' Rebellion, for example, most of the founders believed had been only one example of what could happen if a nation did not defend itself against the unchecked exercise of popular will. Thus, in the new government, only the members of the House of Representatives would be elected directly by the people. Senators would be chosen by the state legislatures. Okay, so there was only direct democracy when it came to the election of the House of Representatives. The president would be chosen by a special electoral college. And this is something that we should talk about further on Friday, because it's really important to understanding the way that democracy functions on the presidential level. The president is chosen by an electoral college that's created by the Constitution, making the presidency even further a step away from direct democracy. Furthermore, federal judges would be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So they would go through a process where the president would appoint somebody, but they wouldn't be immediately become a federal judge. They'd have to go through confirmation hearings through the Senate. So this is the distribution of power. And with this system, on September 17, 1787, 39 delegates signed the Constitution. The constitutional power, this was an unprecedented allocation of powers in the government structure. Power was apportioned between the federal and the state governments. So this is the separation of powers. So on the one hand, federal and state power, the federal government and the state government shared power. On the other hand, the federal government itself was balanced between the executive, the House, the Senate, and the judiciary. So the legislative house, the House and the Senate, was itself divided into two houses. This is the constant breaking off of power, and this comes from the fundamental principle that the revolutionary founders had believed in, was that power was corrupting, they were suspicious of it, that it cannot go unchecked. The Constitution took three powers that already existed in the Articles of Confederation and gave the federal government 10 more powers. So this is when you see the articles listed in the Constitution. An important new power authorized Congress to protect states from riot or disorder. This was something that didn't exist under the Articles of Confederation, and it reflects the experience of Shays' Rebellion. The power to tax was substantially enlarged. So the federal government got new huge powers of taxation, and the federal government also, the power was increased to arm and organize militias, with the president as the commander-in-chief. So this is the way that power was checked, was also expanded. So you're seeing the checks and balances, but also these checks and balances are put in place because what's taking place here in the Constitution is a substantial enlargement of centralized power. Once these battles in the Constitutional Convention were over and the final draft of the Constitution was put together, the battle was really only halfway over. It still had to be ratified by the states. Now, it was within the power of the old Congress to expedite or block the ratification of the new Constitution. That is, under the Articles of Confederation, something like this required a unanimous vote of all the states. The document that the Philadelphia Convention presented was technically only a revision of the Articles of Confederation, so those same rules of unanimity should have still applied, but the last article of the new instrument provided that when ratified by conventions in 9 states, it should go into effect among the states so acting. So it only needed 9 states instead of a unanimous vote. So then followed the arduous process of ratification of the Constitution by specially constituted conventions in all of the individual states. The need for only 9 states was a controversial decision, since the Articles of Confederation could be amended by only by a unanimous vote of all the states. And this is when the battle really begins, and opponents of the Constitution came to the fore. Many of them longtime patriots with credentials that went back to the beginning of the American Revolution. So the question here is, why did some Americans, many of them veterans of the Revolution, oppose the new Constitution? The battle over ratification was divided between people who came to be called themselves Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, most people there agreed on the need for a national government. Yet, once their proposals went back to the state legislatures, there was a problem getting opponents to agree to a new, strong federal nation. And this struggle had the potential to tear the country apart. So it's pitting two versions of revolutionary ideals in opposition. Federalists who are calling for unity, strong national government, um, avoid the tyranny of the mob, avoid fragmentation from the Articles of Confederation, liberal checks and balances on virtue. Versus anti-federalists looking for weak central government and republicanism. Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, these were Federalists who wrote a series of commentaries now known as the Federalist Papers in support of the Constitution and the new instrument of power. They took the name Federalist to suggest a strong central state and the control of the debate as something positive. These commentaries that they wrote on the Constitution, they're very well organized. These individuals were well organized. They had drafted the Constitution. They were part of the convention. And in the Federalist Papers, which is essentially propaganda, they write these long articles, put them out in order to convince people in the states to ratify the Constitution. These commentaries written during the struggle for ratification have been frequently cited by the Supreme Court as an authoritative contemporary interpretation of the meaning of its provisions. And the bitterness of the struggle over ratification and the additional powers to be conferred on the central government can scarcely be exaggerated. So in some states, ratification was effected only after a bitter struggle in the state conventions itself. In every state, the Federalists proved more united, and only they coordinated action between the different states, as the Anti-Federalists were localized and didn't attempt to reach out to additional states. But what were the Anti-Federalists talking about? What were their issues? First of all, they had credentials that were just as impressive as any of the framers of the Constitution when it comes to the American Revolution. People like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, James Monroe, Mercy Otis Warren. They opposed this new Constitution and what it proposed to do. Mercy Otis Warren wrote a series of observations on the new Constitution that really nailed the anti-federalist position. She's one of the consequences, an amazing phenomenon of the Revolution was the prominence of women writing politically. Mercy Otis Warren was one of them. She was also a strong opponent of the Constitution, and the debate in Massachusetts for ratification prompted her to write the observations on the new Constitution under a pseudonym, the Columbian Patriot, which exhibits deep suspicions of the Constitution's intents. She uses language like the Constitution was a result of deep-laid plots. There was a conspiracy in the convention to foist this new federal government on the American people. It was a conspiracy of an aristocratic tyranny. Okay, so this is it's the elites that are putting this Constitution together, and it's going to lead to power being in the hands of the elites, an uncontrolled despotism. She called the Constitution a many-headed monster, that all the branches of government that it's created are actually vehicles of tyranny. So she's somebody who is using the language of the American Revolution. This should be really familiar. It was really rousing language, the same opposition to the British Empire during the American Revolution. She says the Constitution creates arbitrary power. She agrees with the basic arguments of the framers, that there had been an embarrassment of trade, a lack of respectability abroad, a lack of confidence engagement at home during the period of the Articles of Confederation, but she fears a great combination of monarchy, aristocracy, and oligarchy. She says this federal republic is a sham. She says that annual elections are essential, that these longer terms are going to put people in power for longer periods of time, that there's no security for the press or for freedom of thought, that there should be limits on the judiciary, not these lifelong terms. There's not enough division between the executive and the legislature. She says there's no trial by jury. She has a deep suspicion that this is going to lead to a standing army, which is something that comes out of the fears of the revolutionaries during the war. Congress has too much taxing power. Congress has the power to determine its own salaries. There's no term limits set on congressional seats. The Supreme Court's power extends too far. There's not enough direct representation of the people. So she's reaching into pure revolutionary ideals to oppose the Constitution. This is coming from the fountain of the American Revolution, distrusting any government that's far removed from direct control of the people. And that's what she's saying this federal government, this Constitution is creating. She also suspects that the Constitution favors the rich, that it's designed by elites, it's going to lead to more elite power. She wanted a weak federal government and to keep the power in the hands of the states, stronger federal states. The Anti-Federalists wanted a Bill of Rights. That was one of their main arguments, was that there's nothing in this Constitution that protects the individual rights of Americans, that this is all about the allocation of government power. So you can see by looking at this, you talk to most people about the Constitution and they'll say the Constitution is about rights. This is the work of the Anti-Federalists. The original document was about power and was about laws. So the ideas of the Anti-Federalists, although they don't win, the Constitution does get approved. They prove long lasting, first of all, in the creation of the Bill of Rights, and second of all, in the political rhetoric of rights in the United States. So the Anti-Federalists were calling for limits on federal power in the name of individual rights. So this brings us to the next question. What were the limits to power that were placed in the Constitution? Now, the Federalist Papers argued that the amendments, the Bill of Rights and these amendments that the Anti-Federalists were calling for were not necessary to adopt the Constitution. They claim that you should not be afraid that your freedom of speech will be infringed upon, because the Constitution doesn't give any power to the federal government to impinge upon freedom of speech. The Anti-Federalists were not at all okay with that. At that answer, and they insisted that rights of the individuals had to be explicitly laid out in amendments to the Constitution before they would approve ratification. And it was, in fact, during the ratification conventions, states like Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, if they had not gotten a guarantee that the Constitution would be so amended, they wouldn't have ratified the document as it was. But James Madison and others promised that rather than retool the original document of the Constitution, that they would put these concepts into it as amendments, which became the first 10 amendments, or the Bill of Rights. So what are the limits to power that are placed in the Constitution through the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights took some time to be ratified also, so although the Constitution was ratified by 1787, it took until 1791 for the Bill of Rights to be ratified. The Bill of Rights took place in the first Congress that served after the Constitution. In a lot of ways, it was a continuation of that convention. Drafting the Bill of Rights was his first major job. As early as 1789, even Madison had come to agree that some sort of Bill of Rights would be essential to legitimize the new government. So on September 25th, 1789, Congress approved 12 amendments, 10 of which were ratified by the states by the end of 1791. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution comprise what we know as the Bill of Rights. 9 of them place limitations on the new government by forbidding it to infringe on certain fundamental rights. So we're talking about freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to bear arms, immunity from arbitrary arrest, trial by jury, and others. And from arbitrary arrest, search, or seizure. What these say, what these do, is they declare fundamental blocks to federal power, where the government cannot infringe upon individual liberties. In addition to that, as not part of the Bill of Rights, there were protections put into place for property, protections for slavery, limits on taxation. These aren't in the Bill of Rights, these are in the Constitution itself. There was also provisions put in the Constitution, no ex post facto laws, meaning that the government couldn't create a law and then punish someone who had done this crime before the law was created. Also, no religious tests for office. So this is where the separation of church and state comes in, where there's going to be no religious test for you to hold office in government. The Bill of Rights also had very specific terms. Provisions for the judiciary branch were more vague. The Constitution said only the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. It was left to Congress to determine the number of Supreme Court judges to be appointed and the kinds of lower courts to be organized. So in the Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress approved for a Supreme Court of 6 members and a system of lower district courts and a court of appeal. So these are the limitations. This is the power and the limitations that were put into the Constitution. And now, having seen all this, it brings us to the final question here for this video, which you already have some experience from. So in some ways, you're just going to be summing up the argument you already made in your last homework assignment. But based on what you've seen here in this video and on the way the Constitution was debated and put into place and the powers it employed, and your knowledge of the American Revolution, would you argue, was the Constitution revolutionary or counter-revolutionary? Why? So that is, was the Constitution the fulfillment of the American Revolution, or did it in some ways put limits on the revolution, and why? Again, this one should be easy for you because you've already written about it. And so I'll see you all on Friday.